Okay, hey guys. Sorry I was a couple minutes late. I was just waiting to let everyone, into the room. So, okay, I have shared the slides. And so, okay, on that note, we'll just get started. So I'll start out by explaining exactly why I joined Fiveable myself. Personally, it was because of the fact that I thought it was super important that everyone have access to all of the different like resources that people have in terms of AP content, right? And so because AP content is becoming more and more accepted across the country in terms of college credit, that became more important to me because I was really realizing at that point that some people just don't have access to a lot of different resources that I personally do have access to. So at that point, it really did become important to me to be able to share my knowledge personally of exactly the AP knowledge that I had gained throughout high school. And I wanted to make sure that I could gain access to that too. So Quinn, thanks for giving a quick answer. And so Quinn says that it's the division of power between federal and state governments. And so today we're going to be talking about federalism, and I'm your host, Fatma Raja. And so if you haven't already, make sure you give Fiveable a follow on all of their social media. It's at ThinkFiveable on Twitter, Instagram, and on YouTube. So you shouldn't have any trouble finding it as long as you can find one of their handles. It's pretty standard across all of the different platforms. Okay, so if you haven't already made sure that you have notifications on for upcoming AP government streams, make sure you turn them on because at 8 p.m. we're going to have the Declaration of Independence stream that's going to be hosted today by Nicole Johnston. And so she's a teacher, so it's really important that you tune into that one because she's going to have a lot of interesting insight to share. And then tomorrow on September 24th, Robbie May, who's our lead teacher, he's going to be talking about the powers expressed, implied, and concurrent, and denied. And so that's just another addition to talking about powers that the federal government does or does not have. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about me. So my name's Fatma Raja, and this year I'm a senior in Houston, and so I go to Klein High School, and I do debate. And so keeping with the AP government theme, I went to Washington, D.C. this summer, and so if you guys are very curious, feel free to ask about it, and I'll share my experience. So if you haven't already answered, what do you guys know about federalism? Because we touch on it in AP US history, but we don't go that in-depth into it. So like Quinn shared already, she said that it's the division of power between federal and state governments. Do you guys have anything else to add? Okay, and so it seems like no one else has any idea, and that's completely fine because that's the entire reason why I'm doing this stream. Okay, so the definition of federalism is actually not this. Wow, okay, that one's on me. So federalism defined is exactly what Quinn says. It's the division of power between federal and state governments. And so the background on that is some historical context we'll go into first, is that the Articles of Confederation gave the federal government pretty much absolutely no power. And so the government was super dysfunctional. And so in past streams, we've talked about how the Articles of Confederation not having any federal power within them made for a government or a federal government that couldn't do a lot. And so that became really problematic when it came to taxation and making sure that the federal government could help state governments enforce laws. So that's why the delegates called the Constitutional Convention. And so they wanted initially to fix the Articles of Confederation. The intent was not to start a whole nother type of government. But that's actually what ended up happening. And so our current Constitution was born. And so what we have today is the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And so that's exactly what the federalism we have today is encompassed of. So we're going to get a little bit more into that. But before we do you guys want to talk about some key problems with the Articles of Confederation that led to the Constitution? And so you guys can drop your answers within the chat like we've been doing throughout the stream. But we have touched upon this theme like very often. So like, what were issues with the Articles of Confederation that made for the federal government just not being effective enough? So Cecilia says that the central government was too weak. Alexis says that there was no national currency. Yeah, okay, so both of you are pretty like on the ball. So although like the federal government did have the authority to coin currency, just to clarify, it wasn't very effective, especially because the federal government couldn't pay off its debts. And so the money that they were coining just didn't have a lot of value. And so Cecilia says that the government couldn't tax the states. Yeah, that's true. So the government had absolutely no way to like raise troops, which it also could not do because it didn't have any power. And so Quinn also says that there were no national courts. Yeah, that could be pretty problematic if we need to resolve some legal issues. So there were obviously a lot of problems with the Articles of Confederation when it came to sharing state and government power, especially because the state governments had most of it and the federal government had absolutely none. So yeah, now that we've touched upon those issues, let's talk about the important clauses that the Constitution that we currently have established in order to make sure that we have a shared power structure rather than the states having all the power or the federal government having all the power. So the first is the 10th Amendment. And so this is a last amendment in like the original Bill of Rights. And so the main quote that we talk about from it is that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. And so what this means in words that are not from like the 1700s is that if a power isn't given to the federal government explicitly, or if it's not given to the states, or not denied by the states, it means that the state governments or the people would get to have these powers. And so this is pretty much what established federalism, because it said that the state governments and the national government would share power. And so that's a very important theme, because it means that now we don't have a system where either the federal government has all of the power and stops state governments from doing anything, because that would be very tyrannical, and it's exactly what our founders wanted to prevent. But we also didn't have a system where all of the state governments had all the power and the federal government was ineffectual and couldn't do anything. So that's pretty much where our federalism comes from. Okay, on to the Supremacy Clause. And so this is from Article 6 of the Constitution. And this pretty much says that laws made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law in the land. And what this means, once again, in talk that isn't 1700s, is that federal laws can nullify state laws and that they always supersede them. So, for example, if Texas, which is where I live, passes a law that says that everyone can hunt owls, and the federal government all of a sudden is like, no one can hunt owls. That means that the federal government law supersedes Texas's law. And so now, even though Texas did have a law that said that owls could be hunted, because this federal government said that it wasn't allowed, no one can any longer hunt owls within the United States. And so that's just an example. There's no like owl hunting laws that actually exist that I know of off the top of my head, but it pretty much means that the federal government is in its power is over everyone else's. So even though that's true, the federal government can't veto or review state laws before they're passed. And so what that means is if there's a law in the Texas or Louisiana or any other state's legislature, the federal government can't preemptively veto that law. Like the federal government has to let that law pass if the state chooses to pass that law. And then if they really want to, they can pass a law that nullifies it. But even then there might be like a challenge in the courts. But the Supremacy Clause, although it says that the federal government gets the final say in most things, can still be challenged within the courts. So it's not like all ending at the end of the day. And so another clause that's incredibly important is the elastic clause. And so this one is found within Article 1 of the Constitution. And so this is one of the clauses that allows for a lot of debate because it says that Congress has the power to make all laws that are necessary and proper to carry out the execution of foregoing powers and all other powers vested by the Constitution. And so what this means is that Congress and the executive branches have the power to make laws that they have to make in order to execute the powers that they have. So, for example, because the federal government has taxation power, it can, for example, make a law creating an agency that collects those taxes. Like, for example, the Internal Revenue Service or the IRS. So it means that because there were a lot of circumstances where Congress and the federal government were not able to specifically lay out exactly what powers the federal government would have, it gave them a little bit of room to wiggle around and create new laws if they didn't have the power already vested within them to enforce the laws that the Constitution gave them. So it pretty much allows the federal government to carry out the powers that it has. And so it also allows them to make hierarchical structures. And so what that means is that we have the Supreme Court, right? And then Congress decided, you know what, we need some district courts to allow for cases to also be carried out at a lower level. And then they also established lower courts. And so they can make like structures that are beneath the federal government like throughout the nation. So creating hierarchies within the country. So that's what the necessary and proper clause allows like the federal government to do. And so another very important one is the full faith and credit clause. And so you guys probably remember from the Articles of Confederation where it was the existence of 13 separate sovereign states. So although everyone was technically part of the United States of America, they weren't really under one federal jurisdiction because the federal government didn't have any power. So what the full faith and credit clause did was that it made sure that every other state would have to give respect to each state's public acts, records, and judicial proceedings. And so the reason why this was incredibly important was it meant that states have to give each other respect. So if, for example, Louisiana, which did not exist back in the colonial days in terms of it being the state it is today, passed a law that said that we can't hunt groundhogs anymore, Texas couldn't come in and say, actually, Louisianans, you can't hunt groundhogs, because it has to give respect to the other states' laws. So they can't interfere or nullify with other state laws. They can just govern their own territories and states. And so it also means that if someone commits a crime in Texas or Louisiana or any other state, another state, if it catches that criminal, has to return and extradite whatever person was caught in order to make sure that they get a trial in the state where they committed their crime. So it pretty much means that states can't just fight each other over small disagreements and that they have to respect whatever the other state decides. And so, okay, I have a question for you guys. Which clause or amendment allows federal laws to nullify state laws? And this is after the state law has been passed. So it's not like the federal law preemptively saying that even if a law hasn't been passed, it's not allowed to be passed. Okay, so feel free to answer in the chat. So just as a note, this isn't one of those predictive questions. I've already talked about it in a previous slide. Okay, so Quinn says it's the Supremacy Clause. Okay, any other answers? Okay, Landon also says it's the Supremacy Clause. Okay, so both of you are absolutely right. It is the Supremacy Clause. So oftentimes what we see in federal laws is that they have in very ending at the very end of the entire law, it says that all other acts are hereby nullified. So if the federal government passes a law, any other laws that were passed before that disagree with that, they're all nullified. And so the most recent act is the one that gets followed. So that is the Supremacy Clause. Okay, So now that we know the important clauses and parts of the Constitution that specified what kinds of powers every level of government would have and how those powers would work, let's delve into the different types of powers that the federal and state governments either share or have independently. Okay, so the first is enumerated federal powers. These are powers that are specifically granted to the federal government, and they're found in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. So these examples of enumerated powers include the power to coin money, to regulate commerce, to declare war, and to raise and maintain armed forces. So those are some of the major powers that only the federal government is allowed to exercise. So to talk about coining money, for example, the reason why that's super important is because if we had 50 different currencies that existed within the United States, it would be incredibly hard for the national government to create effective, fiscal policy when it came to the international stage, but it would also be really hard for everyone to exchange money every single time that they traveled. So one of the reasons why it's super important for the federal government to be the only person or the only entity that can actually coin money is so we're not constantly arguing over how many Texan dollars, how much Texan dollars are worth compared to Washington dollars. So that's one of the reasons why the federal government has these very specific federal powers, because if the state governments had them, there would be a lot more chaos and a lot less uniformity, and it would make everyone's lives much more difficult. So enumerated federal powers are specifically granted only to the federal government. We also have implied federal powers. And so these powers are not specifically stated within the Constitution, but because of the elastic clause, also known as the necessary and proper clause, they can be inferred. So oftentimes, like we talked about, there might be situations where in order for the federal government to actually exercise its powers that were enumerated to them, it would have to have some inferred powers. So an example of that would be Alexander Hamilton's federal bank. So this was very hotly debated when the federal bank was actually established. And so one of the powers that the courts have is to debate and then decide how federal powers should be delegated. And so if the courts decide that this specific implied federal power actually is not a federal power, then the states get to make that decision. But if the courts decide that it is implied within the Constitution, then that becomes an implied federal power. And so it falls under the necessary and proper clause. So oftentimes it's sort of like the fine print. Okay, and so another kind of federal power is inherent federal power. And so this oftentimes isn't really specifically stated in the Constitution, but you can logically deduce that this would be a federal power from just the fact that the national government exists. So for example, because we have a national government, a lot of you guys might remember from AP US history that the Louisiana Purchase happened. But it might be more difficult to understand why a state made the Louisiana Purchase if it was a separate state making that. So instead of that happening, we have the federal government that's allowed to purchase land and then divide it based on however they so choose. So things like buying land to expand the country, that's an inherent federal power. So just because we have a national government and we have a country, the United States federal government is allowed to purchase land. And that's just a thing that happens because we have a national government. So another kind of power is a state power. And so these are powers that are specifically reserved for only the states. And so one of the important reasons why we have powers that are specifically reserved to only the states is because it allows for these separate states to be proving ground or think tanks for policy. So for example, one of the things that happened that was adopted at a federal level, but it first happened at the state level, was referendums. And so adding things to the ballot so people could vote on specific policies was originally something that happened at the state level. And so it eventually became it's not a national policy now, but it was expanded to different states. And so the only reason why that was able to happen was because states are allowed to choose whether or not they actually have policies that get on the ballot. So every single person can vote on them. And so another one is direct election of senators. So this is a policy that was actually adopted at the national level, but before it happened for like the entire United States directly electing its senators, it's something that separate states chose to do. So when separate states are allowed to choose how they make their policy and have more flexibility, we get new policies coming out, and it's very important when it comes to democracy, but it also allows for like innovation in terms of like how states govern themselves. And so some examples of things that only states are allowed to regulate are things like property rights and education. So if you think about it, public education is regulated at the state level. So sometimes like civics education might be mandated in Texas, but it might not be mandated in another state. And so there's a lot of flexibility when it comes to that. And then there's another kind of power, and it's called concurrent power. This is power that the state government and the federal government share together. And so it allows states to govern themselves, but it still allows them to accept federal aid. And so we're going to go more into depth about how concurrent powers are oftentimes used by the federal governments and state governments. But the things that we need to remember about them is that the important thing is that the federal and state government work together a lot. And so especially nowadays where the federal government gives a lot of funding to state governments, there's a lot of powers that they hold together. So things like enforcing laws, like we have local deputies and sheriff's departments, but we also have the FBI. So there's that federal enforcement of law, but there's also the state level enforcement that's happening. Another kind is establishing courts. So that's something that happens all the time. Like we have our local Harris County Court where you can go register to vote, but we also have the Supreme Court. So things like building infrastructure, courts, taxation, and enforcing laws, they're all examples of concurrent powers, stuff that the state government and the federal governments share together. So they work together in order to make sure that the country can actually function. So here's a question for all of you guys. To make sure that you guys are all paying attention, what's an example of a power that's reserved only for the federal government? And so state governments don't share the power and they don't hold the power alone. And so you can just give the letter answer in the chat. And so A is taxation, B is declaring war, and C is regulating property rights. Okay. So Quinn says making money. Everyone seems to be saying B. Okay, so yeah, like Quinn, you're right. It is making money is a only federal government power, but also B is right. Declaring war is not something that the states can do, and that's, I would say, something that's very beneficial to everyone, because if states were constantly getting into fights and declaring war on each other, we probably wouldn't have a very unified nation. Like that's exactly what happened when the Civil War happened. So yeah. Declaring war is something that only the federal government can do. Okay, so now that we've talked about the different ways that federalism was established within our own government, and now that we've understood what the different types of power that exist within the federal and state government, let's talk about the different kinds of federalism. And so the first is basic federalism. That means that power is divided between the state governments and the federal government. And so they both have the authority to exercise their powers. And so in the United States, the way that works is that we have the federal government. And so that's made up of Congress, the Supreme Court, and the executive branch. And we also have state governments. And so the way that works on different state levels, they're allowed to decide whatever they want to do in terms of legislation, but the federal government also has power. So that's basic federalism. And so I think if you guys have any questions about that, feel free to ask them in the chat or click the ask a question feature, and I can go more into detail about basic federalism. But that's pretty much what it is. Now we have dual federalism. And so dual federalism is very oftentimes compared to the layer cake. That's how I learned it when I was in AP government last year. And so the layer cake, when you look at it, the different layers are very starkly divided. So you can see where the vanilla is, and then you see the layer of frosting. And so that means that federal governments are limited. super limited to only specifically what's stated in the Constitution. So everything that isn't stated in the Constitution is allowed to be governed by the sovereign states. And so it means that the state governments are allowed to exercise their powers however they want to, because it's their power to exercise, and the federal government is only allowed to do what's in the Constitution. And so if there's any disputes or disagreements that happens in the terms of the layer cake and which powers the federal government has or the sovereign states, the Supreme Court gets to decide. Okay, so Ashley asked, what about the Supremacy Clause though? Yeah, so we talked about the Supremacy Clause and how that applies to our Constitution. And so this is just the different kinds of federalism. So at the end of this section, spoiler, I'm gonna ask you guys what kind of federalism we have today. So these are a bunch of different types of federalism that exist and the US government has evolved. And so the Supremacy Clause in this context wouldn't exactly apply, because the Supremacy Clause is something that's separate from dual federalism, but it's just dual federalism is just an example of one kind of federalism that exists out in the world. Okay, so the next kind is cooperative federalism. And so the reason why it's called cooperative federalism is because federal, state, and local governments cooperate with each other and work together in order to solve common problems. And so a lot of times federal and state governments in cooperative federalism, they make policies together instead of separately. Because if you think about it, if they're working together to solve problems, that means that they oftentimes it would be easier for them to work together instead of just working separately in order to solve a problem. So in cooperative federalism, there's a lot of integrated work that's happening. And so state and local governments, they might still have different policies based on regional differences. So it wouldn't make a lot of sense for a state like Colorado to adopt a water saving policy when it compared to Arizona. So just if there's geographic differences, if there's population differences, state and local governments can still change how they're adopting policy. But in cooperative federalism, the entire point of it is to cooperate between the federal and state and local governments. So if you ever have a question about cooperative federalism, just remember everyone's just working together. That's why it's called cooperative federalism. Okay, so question, what factors do you guys think influence the different kinds of federalism? Because there's obviously a lot of different types, and we haven't been through all of them in terms of terminology, but there's obviously a lot of different things that go into creating a government. And so one of the things we learned from the Articles of Confederation was that we might not want a weak central government. Okay, so Alexis Allen says demographics. Yeah, so you might want a different government based on how old a population is or what the different races are. And so people could also choose to vote for a different kind of federalism. So if someone believes that we want a stronger central government, they might be voted into office or vice versa. So you guys can also if anyone else has any answers, feel free to put them in the chat. Okay, Alexis says political beliefs. Yeah, that's also another one. So if there's a lot of people that are governing, that are in power, that believe that the federal government should be very hands-off, then that might mean that we might have the layer cake federalism, where the only powers that the federal government is expressing is what's specifically stated in the Constitution. So what I'm trying to get at here is one of the reasons why the Federalist enforcement of the federal government has changed so much in America is because our political beliefs have changed, our demographics have changed. So if there's a lot of change happening in the American federal government, that's why, because we have a democracy where a lot of people's views change over time. And so the people that we are electing into office also changes over time. And so there's a lot of different factors that end up influencing the kind of federalism that is actually enforced. Okay, so another kind of federalism that we have is marble cake federalism. And so you guys might be noticing a theme where a lot of the different terminology when it comes to federalism is based on types of cake. And that might just be because the political scientist who like made these terms was hungry, but it's probably because it's like an easy metaphor for everyone to like understand. And so when you look at that marble cake, like the chocolate and vanilla, it's all mixed up. So what marble cake federalism has is that every level of government is working together on pretty much every issue. So you don't really have like these fixed roles when it comes to the levels of government. So like the agencies and the jobs that the state and local governments and federal governments are working together on, they mix together because they're all trying to solve different problems. So it makes sense for the state and federal governments to like work together. And so one of the important things to remember, though, is that the federal government, and one of the reasons why it works so closely with state governments, is because it just has more jurisdiction and it has more power and money. So that is very important when it comes to states wanting to like enforce laws or maybe improve their like social safety net. And so, yeah, that's one of the reasons why they work together so much when it comes to marble cake federalism. Oh, so Ashley says that she thinks it would work better with a small country rather than a big one like the United States. Oh, yeah, I get what you're saying there, because it might make sense for like a smaller country to have local governments working more closely together because they have like less regional differences. In the United States, like has more. Oh, so Samiksha is asking, what kind of federalism does the US have? Okay, so that's a question that I'm going to ask later in the chat. So why don't we go through the next couple of slides first, and then we're going to get back to your question. Don't even worry about it. Okay, so the next kind of federalism is competitive federalism. And so when we think about competitive federalism, what I want you guys to remember is a free market. And so the United States is very much like a capitalist free market economy. And so that's exactly what competitive federalism draws upon. It means that cities and states and the federal government, but not really, competes to create the most attractive like taxation and social service policies. So that means that citizens, who are like the people who get to choose where they live in different areas based on these policies. So if you're a business person, you might want to like live in a state that doesn't have a lot of taxation policies. But if you're someone who's like just a teacher or like someone who's not really focused on the business sector, you might want to work in an area that has maybe higher taxes, but a better social safety net. So just based on like how you live your life, companies and citizens, like they both get to choose where they're going to live based on the same things, like for example, taxation and social services. So that's a different kind of federalism that like, yeah, we do see to some extent when like cities compete for like bids. Like you guys might remember when Amazon was competing, or different cities were competing to get the Amazon headquarters, they all submitted like different taxation and tax breaks that they might give Amazon. So like we do have essences of competitive federalism within our cities and our states, but we also have permissive federalism. And so permissive federalism, it's sort of like, you might think it's a little bit of a misnomer because it means that federalism shares powers. But in permissive federalism, the extent to which state governments are allowed to exercise their power is based on how much the federal government allows it. So the federal government could totally choose in permissive federalism to rein in the power of state governments. So I can just, spoiler alert, tell you guys that we don't really have a very permissive federalism system because it might, like, the founders feared that it might lead to a lot of like tyranny from the like federal government. So that's not something that we see a lot of in the United States. So yeah, but it is a different kind of federalism that exists. So one of the questions that was asked earlier in the chat, we're going to repeat. What type of federalism do you guys think we have today? So you guys can answer your questions, but Ashley asks, isn't ours kind of the opposite because of the Constitution? Yeah, it is kind of the opposite because it says our Constitution at least says that states get to have all of the powers that the Constitution doesn't specifically give to the federal government. Okay, so Cecilia says we have basic federalism. Kaya says we have dual federalism. Ashley says we have a mix of like all of them. Alexa says we have competitive. Okay, seeing no more guesses and answers, the kind of federalism that we have today is kind of like mixed up. Like we do have all of these different kinds of federalism. And so what a lot of people say we have today is marble cake federalism, because the federal government gets to work very closely with state governments. And sometimes it gives like different like incentives for state governments to agree with it and do what the federal government wants it to do. But we also have essences of competitive federalism, where like states are competing for different kinds of like investment and stuff like that. So overall, the kind of federalism that we have today is very like, it's very much a combination of everything. So you might just want to say that we have a marble cake federalism, because like all of the different powers are mixed together. Okay, so yeah, like I said, the federalism that America employs has changed over the years. So we have the marble cake kind today. And so, yeah, that's true. Okay, so one of the reasons why we say we have marble cake federalism today is because the federal government gives something called grants. So grants are pretty much, it's money. So the federal government collects a lot of money in taxes. So in 2017, the federal government collected $3.3 trillion in taxes. And that is a lot of money. So obviously a lot of money. And so what the federal government does with these taxes is that sometimes it actually asks, why are we so in debt then? That's because we use our money for other things than paying off debts. Okay, but yeah, the federal government, when it's not paying off debts, sometimes uses the money that it collects in taxation to convince state governments to do what it wants. And so because state governments have less money, they oftentimes agree to do what the federal government wants, because then they can, if they so choose, sometimes lower taxes or like use money and allocate it in a different way, because they have federal governments funding whatever programs that they want. So there's a lot of different kinds of grants. And so we're going to go over the 3 or 4 main ones right now. And so categorical formula grants. So this money, it has a specific purpose. So it can be like building a road or building schools. And so it's given to states and local governments based on a formula. So this formula, it isn't the one that I like put as a picture or graphic, but it takes a lot of different factors into account. So if we're building schools across the nation, you might want to give areas that have a larger population more money. So that's taken into account when like the federal government is calculating how much money to give the state and local governments. So it's very much like subject to federal conditions and regulations. So sometimes the federal government mandates that states and local governments, they match funds. So if the federal government is giving $100, that means the local or state government also has to give $100. And so because the federal government is giving this money with like, by taking different factors into account, it wants to make sure that that money isn't misused, especially because if the money is given out based on a very specific like section of the population, then the federal government supervises how those funds are used in order to make sure that it isn't misused or like used for other things other than like, as this example is, building schools. Okay, another kind of grant is a project grant. And so within project grants, like it's pretty much for a specific project. So states and local governments and sometimes like universities can like submit applications for the grant. And so Congress can like give the like grant based on who applied and like how much funding they might need. And so sometimes like research grants, like universities like apply for them. And so states sometimes apply for employment training grants. So like in the case of universities applying for research grants, like there's something called, for example, orphan diseases. And so orphan diseases are different kinds of diseases that don't get a lot of research. So if like the university or like state like research agency chooses to apply for a project grant for orphan diseases, the federal government might like let that happen and like appropriate those funds because there's not a lot of people researching them. So Ashley says, yeah, is that Missouri? Mississippi? Roads suck. So we get money for roads, but they somehow don't get better. Yeah. Oh, Michigan. Okay, I see you. Yeah, sometimes funds are used in different areas. So like they might be fixing the roads in a different area of the state, but not where you live. I don't know a lot about how Michigan's road infrastructure funding is being used. So yeah, those are project grants. They're like for a specific project. That's why they're called project grants. Okay, and another kind of grant is a block grant. And so this money is given for like a very like broad purpose. So although it like has a specific area thing that it should be used for, it can be used in a lot of different ways. So like if you're giving money for health services, the state might choose to use that in terms of its like Medicare services, or it might choose to expand its clinics. So states have a lot of different ways on how they can like choose to spend the money. And so even though they get that choice and it's super beneficial because, you know, Michigan might not have a lot of like clinics in their state, and so they might choose to expand those. After that money is used, the state doesn't get any more funding. So it's just like, here, you get this block of cash, and after you spend it, however you want to spend it, that's it. That's all you get. You use your block of cash. And so it doesn't have a lot of federal rules and regulations, but states should still be careful on how they use that funding, because once it's gone, it's gone. So they should still be careful. Okay, so I have another question for you guys. What kind of grants are given only if the state applies for them? So A is block grants, B is project grants, and C is categorical formula grants. So you guys can just say the letter in the chat. Okay, so everyone seems to be saying project grants, and you guys are all right. It is project grants. So yeah, remember, project grants are given for a specific project. Okay, so what do I want you guys to take away from this stream? So the first thing is that the federal and state governments have different powers that were granted to them by the Constitution. So in some cases, the federal government and state government's roles were clearly outlined. Like, for example, only the federal government is allowed to declare wars or like coin money. But at the same time, sometimes their powers are flexible. So if there's a case where the federal government needs a different law to be passed in order to enforce one of its existing powers, then the Elastic Clause allows the federal government to pass that law and choose to like enforce whatever it wants. But the federal and state government, the federal government also has ways to get the state government to do what it wants. And so that's pretty much grants in that whole section that we covered, because like, wouldn't the state government always like want more funding to do and improve whatever issues it has going on in the state? So the federal government a lot of times uses like funding incentives to get state governments to do whatever federal policy is currently popular within that like Congress and the executive branch. So that being said, do you guys have any questions? You can feel free to ask them right now in the chat, or like just click the ask a question button, and I will try my best to answer them. And so, okay, I want you guys to remember, if anyone's like feeling a little too shy to ask a question, the entire point of this stream is to help you guys like learn about federalism. And so there are going to be follow-up like streams. So, okay, Landon asks, what's the difference between cooperative and marble cake federalism? So, okay, one of the things that I didn't specifically mention is that these different types of federalism, they have a lot of overlap. So specifically, cooperative federalism is the idea where at the state level and at the federal level, the governments are working together in order to get these laws and policies passed. And so they're discussing what the issue is, and then they're taking whatever that is into account and passing a law based on that. Whereas in marble cake federalism, there's just a lot of overlap in terms of what the local and state and federal government is doing. So they're just all working together in one cohesive area. But in cooperative federalism, they're working together, but they're not all doing the exact same thing. If that makes sense, I can clarify. Okay. Yeah. No problem, Landon. Just here to help. Okay, so Cecilia asks, so wouldn't you say that the idea for federalism is from the Federalist Papers, but from the division of powers distributed between the state and federal governments? Yeah, so the Federalist Papers pretty much aimed to get the Constitution as it was written passed. So the Constitution did have specific provisions for the federal government, and so one of the concessions the Federalist Papers writers ended up making and the Federalists ended up making was that we would attach the Bill of Rights after the Constitution was ratified. And so that's where the 10th Amendment came from. And so yeah, the Federalist Papers argued for a division of power between the three different branches, but they also were in favor of having the state and federal government share power together, because they just wanted to make sure that the central government wasn't super weak. Okay, so what is Federalist Paper number 10 mainly about? Okay, so you know what? I'm actually going to drop the link for the stream over the Federalist Papers. Okay, Ashley says factions. Yeah, actually, yeah, I'll go into a little bit more detail about that. So Federalist Paper number 10 talks about how inherent to human nature is that we are going to have factions. So people are going to disagree and naturally have different opinions about how a government should function. So what James Madison was really worried about was these factions coming into power based on just passionate ideas and then suppressing the rights of people who were in the minority. So what James Madison said was that we should make sure that the federal government has representative democracy. So everyone couldn't just come together in this mob madness and mob ideal and just choose to change the government. Instead, representatives would be in charge of making sure that that passion was sort of contained and they were using their rational, logical minds in order to have governance that wasn't suppressing everyone's rights. So that's what Federalist 10 was about. Cecilia asks, so the Anti-Federalists would be against the distribution of powers because they wanted the states to have most of the powers, trying not to fall back into tyranny, right? So yeah, Anti-Federalists wanted a central government that was very decentralized. So they wanted states to have most of the power rather than the federal government. Yeah. Okay, any more questions? Okay, so seeing no more questions, I will say, oh, okay, Brandon says, sorry I'm late, quick question about federalism. Is education slash marriage managed by the states or the federal government? Okay, so education is regulated on the state level, and so sometimes the federal government does have policies like Common Core where they give more funding to states based on if whether or not the state governments decide to cooperate with that federal policy, but mostly education is managed at the state level. Marriage is a little bit more complicated. So although marriage is managed very much at the state level, sometimes the federal government can like step in and like decide whether or not something was like constitutional or not. So like what we saw with like specifically gay marriage was that the like Supreme Court decided that this is like a right. So the Supreme Court intervened at like the federal level to make sure that states weren't denying everyone's rights. So that's what happened with like education and marriage. So they're mostly governed at the state level, but sometimes the federal government can do things to like ensure equality or like make sure that no one's being discriminated against. Okay, on that note, I hope you guys gained a better understanding of the different kinds of federalism that America has gone through and what the different vocabulary that we use is when it comes to federalism and how the federal government decides to like enforce different ideas that it wants on state governments and get them to cooperate. So I hope everyone has a great night, and I hope that you guys tune in to our next AP government stream, which is starting very, very soon. So have a good night, guys. Bye-bye.